A US helicopter raid into Syria allegedly kills a key figure involved in the smuggling of fighters into Iraq. But Damascus denounces the attack as criminal and a terrorist aggression. So what was the real motive for the raid? And is this a final roll of the dice for President Bush's war on terror? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. Well, as his presidency comes to an end, George Bush could be risking another wave of anti-American sentiment in the Middle East. A senior member of Al-Qaeda has reportedly been killed in a US helicopter raid on a Syrian village near the Iraqi border. An unnamed US official said the Special Forces raid was targeting the smuggling of fighters into Iraq. But Syria says 8 civilians were killed in the attack, including 4 children. The Syrian government says the raid was against international law and that it was a terrorist aggression by the United States. The Iraqi government has also denounced the raid, saying it doesn't want its territory to be used as a launch pad for US attacks on its neighbours. Officially, the US has not acknowledged its involvement in the attack.
We obviously don't know the details, but it sounds to me like this was an effort to stop the flow of terrorists into Iraq. That Syria has allowed these terrorists use of its territory over the years. This is a rare instance, but I think it's intended to send a clear signal to Damascus that they need to get their side of the border under control.
Well, some observers outside the US government argue that the raid could have been prevented if Syria had not failed to secure its border with Iraq. This is something the Syrian government strenuously denies.
Why did they not come to the Syrian government and say, look, we think this is what is happening? Why didn't they do it through legal channels instead of violating airspace, violating Syrian territory and going about it in this terrible manner? We are monitoring the area as much as possible. We have asked for night equipment, night goggles, which we have not been given by the US administration or the British. At the end of the day, let us remember that this is a porous border, it is a long border, and the US is not doing enough on its side to monitor this border.
Well, joining us now are our guests in Washington, D.C., David Schenker. He's director of the Arab Politics Program at the Washington Institute. In Damascus, Marwan Kabalan. He's a political analyst and foreign policy expert at Damascus University. And in London, Simon Tisdall. He's an assistant editor and foreign affairs columnist at The Guardian newspaper. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. David Schenker in Washington, D.C., let me start with you, if I may. I mean, what do you make of this latest operation? Is the American message that there's no hiding place for Al-Qaeda?
I think that has been the U.S. message all along, that states voluntarily give up their rights of sovereignty if they're providing sanctuary to Al-Qaeda. We know that Syria has been doing that since 2003, at least. There's state-sanctioned travel of jihadis across the territory into Iraq. That's been ongoing. The U.S. has protested the Syrian government, has provided them with information, and they've taken no action against it. So this is a long-standing problem. They also export these terrorists not only to Iraq, of course, but also to Lebanon and periodically to Jordan. If you are providing sanctuary, you're not taking enough action, then the U.S. has had a long-standing policy of crossing borders, of engaging in hot pursuit. This is not a matter, I think, from the U.S. government point of view, of capabilities. This is a matter of will. Most of these insurgents have landed at Damascus airport and made their way across the border with Syrian government permission, or at least tolerance. All
right, well, let's bring in Simon Tisdall there in London. Simon, we've seen the US take cross-border action into Pakistan on a number of occasions, and now this raid into Syria. How significant do you think this raid is?
Well, I think it's a development, an extension of a pattern that's already been in existence for some time. As David just said, the United States, since 9/11, has taken upon itself the right to pursue Al-Qaeda or other types of terrorists wherever they may be hiding. And both the presidential candidates who will fight the election next week take a similar view. That's not likely to change. And I think in Pakistan you've seen an operation in September which extended that doctrine, if you like, to a right to self-defense or preemptive self-defense. We can go across the border, the Americans say, into Pakistani territory will do that on the ground if necessary, but usually through drone aircraft in the air. And now they've now extended that once again, this right of self-defense as they see it, into Syria. I mean, it begs an interesting question about where else the Bush administration in the dying days of this presidency might wish to stray. It's complained recently, published recently, documents suggesting that there are training camps inside Iran for Iraqi insurgents. Is that the next target? Will Bush go after those alleged camps before he leaves office in January?
All right, well, let's get the view from Damascus and bring in Marwan Kabalan. Many in Washington say this raid was necessary because Syria isn't doing enough to stop terrorist infiltration coming across the Syrian border into Iraq. What's your response to those who say that Syria is still exporting terrorism to Iraq, as David Schenker in Washington seems to be saying?
Well, I think this has been the argument of the Bush administration since perhaps day 5 of the invasion. We all remember Donald Rumsfeld actually accusing Syria on March 27, 5 days after the invasion of Iraq, accusing Syria of actually supplying the Iraqis with night goggles to actually carry out to resist the Americans or the American invasion. I think this is not something new for the Syrian government. What is really new is the timing of the raid. I mean by that, after Syria has been actually trying to tighten its control over the borders with Iraq by deploying more than 7,000 troops and establishing more than 500 checkpoints alongside the borders with Iraq. And after Syria actually decided to recognize the Iraqi government and establish an embassy in Baghdad and send also an ambassador there. So after all that, after all this cooperation from the Syrian side, I mean, this raid was really surprising for many here in this country. Many people actually were just questioning the motives of the Bush administration. If this raid was necessary, so I mean, what the Bush administration was doing actually over the past 5 years, why now? Why not actually for example, in 2004 or 2005 when the crisis between Syria and Washington over Iraq was in its peak?
OK, we'll come back to some of the political ramifications a bit later in the programme. Let's bring in back David Schenker there in Washington, D.C. David, I mean, Marwan Kabalan seems to be saying that Syria is taking steps to improve border security, but presumably it is difficult to secure the border 100% if you haven't got full cooperation from the Iraqis and the Americans.
Well, I don't think anybody doubts that the Syrians have taken some steps in recent years to do a better job in securing their borders. Nevertheless, as CENTCOM has said, that jihadis continue to flow. Nobody is saying that Syria can do a perfect job 100%. It's a long border, no doubt. But there still is obviously a significant problem if you have these type of figures residing on the border. We have to remember that during the days of Saddam Hussein, when Syria and Iraq were enemies, this border was hermetically sealed. Once again, we get back to the issue of whether this is a matter of capability or a matter of will. I wouldn't read too much into the timing of this. We know that Secretary of State Rice has met with Walid Muallim and that Assistant Secretary Welsh has met with the Foreign Minister of Syria. The United States is actually looking for better relations with Syria, but they have consistently taken no action on their borders to really clamp down in a fashion that would put an end to this. And I think that the U.S. policy has been, zero tolerance, that they are going to cross the borders. They had no confidence that they gave this intelligence to the Syrians that they would have done anything about it. And I think there's good reason. Even back as early as 2003, then Syrian Foreign Minister Farouk Shara said, it's in the interest of Syria to see the U.S. invasion of Iraq defeated. They've taken steps over the years to ensure that the U.S. invasion would be defeated. It hasn't worked, but they have worked against it.
OK, Simon Tisdall in London, how much does this raid highlight the limitations of Iraq's sovereignty and the instability of its border with Syria?
Well, the Iraqi government seemed to have been taken by surprise by this event on Sunday evening. Initially, a spokesman seemed to suggest that and somehow it was justified that the group of terrorists, alleged terrorists, targeted had been responsible for attacks inside Iraq. Then they thought about it a bit more and then came back and said, well, actually, we're not sure we really like this because we don't want Iraq to be used as a launch pad for American or other attacks on other people's country, and that is a very important issue for all the neighbours of Iraq. The Iranians have concerns that a continuing US military presence after this December, assuming a new status of forces agreement is agreed, could be used as staging posts for similar types of incursions inside Iran. And of course the northern border is very unstable between the Kurdish-controlled areas and Turkey, and there's been a lot of fighting there over the last 12 months. The central government in Baghdad hasn't really got much control over that any more than it has control over what happens down in Anbar. So I think it has highlighted the weakness of the central government and also the tensions between the United States and their Iraqi hosts.
It's an interesting point you make about those weaknesses. Let me put that point to Marwan Kamal in Damascus. I mean, the fact that the US can effectively operate with impunity across the Syrian border surely underlines the military and political weakness of the Assad government.
Well, I might not agree actually with this assessment, because we all know that we are comparing here a superpower, which is the United States, I mean, which has the biggest, perhaps, military arsenal in the world, and on the other hand, we have Syria, third world country with limited resources, military, economic, and otherwise. So the comparison here doesn't make really any sense in my opinion. Taking that the Americans have been trying to challenge Russia, to challenge much bigger powers actually in the international system. So I don't see any point of comparing between the two countries. But if you allow me, I mean, to go back to the point actually David made earlier in the program when he said that the Bush administration is trying to improve relations with Damascus, I don't really agree with this assessment, because over the past actually 5 years since the invasion of Iraq, and the Bush administration is trying actually to undermine, to destabilize the Syrian regime, sometime by using this regime change, sometime using another approach, behavior change of the Syrian regime. And in recent months, actually, the Bush administration has been sending mixed messages, I mean, to Syria. On the one hand, for example, before the meeting between Condoleezza Rice and Walid al-Muallim in New York, George Bush was actually in the United Nations accusing Syria of being a state sponsor of terrorism and allowing foreign fighters to infiltrate the borders with Iraq. And 2 days later, I mean, Condoleezza Rice was meeting with Muallim. So we don't really know what the Bush administration policy concerning Syria. But after all, I believe that the Bush administration has never had the intention to improve relations with Syria, and I believe this raid perhaps is also has also been carried out in order perhaps to put more obstacles for the next administration to improve relations with Syria.
Okay, gentlemen, stay with us, won't you? Because it's time for a short break now. But when we come back, we examine the wider political impact of the US raid into Syria. More on that. Stay with us.